Chapter 6 The Changing Scene. The end of 1914 and Turkey at war. How little that meant to me then, or to my family, save perhaps my father, who had the gift of vision and foresaw things more clearly. Just at first, there was no change in my home. It is true, I no longer went to school, but the events of the house continued without change. One evening, our neighbours were to dine, and, war or no war, food must still be served, wine decanted. My grandmother took an active interest in this little, quiet dinner party. She felt she could not trust Faraday to do everything properly and lamented the loss of Hajar. One of the dinner party dishes she particularly wanted prepared was lahana dolmasha, stuffed cabbage leaves, of which she was very fond, and she spent the entire morning complaining to my mother that Faraday would ruin them. Eventually, she marched into the kitchen herself, tied a large overall over her black satin dress, deposited her many rings in a safe place, and started to prepare the lahana dolmasha. She explained to Faraday that although she had never actually cooked them, she nevertheless knew perfectly well how to do it. Apparently, Faraday watched her noisy preparations with a great deal of misgiving, and found difficulty in getting on with any other work since my grandmother continually got in her way. I was allowed into the kitchen to watch. I was continually directed to do this, that, and the other, all the dirtiest jobs, incidentally. She called Faraday to her side and gave a demonstration of how onions should be chopped, looked up directions in an old cookery book, and disagreed with them. She chopped the onions with great gusto, calling upon my mother and Inja to witness her handiwork. Whilst my grandmother busily explained to us how capable she was, Faraday was frantically trying to interrupt her to tell her the cabbage leaves were boiling over, and what should she do with them. My grandmother disregarded her. My mother said thoughtfully that it did seem to her rather a lot of rice was being prepared, surely too much for a quiet dinner party for a few people. My grandmother airily disregarded her too, and proceeded to wash and drain the rice. She then proceeded to mix her finely chopped onions with it, and poor Faraday, unable to stand the strain any longer, burst into loud tears. My grandmother paused in the mixing, looking with astonishment at the violently weeping Faraday, and asked her what was wrong. Poor Faraday gasped between the paroxysms that shook her that the onions had to be cooked with sham fistigle, nuts and olive oil, before being mixed with the rice. My grandmother paused uncertainly, then demanded from my mother what the cookery book said. The cookery books, unfortunately, said the same as Faraday. My grandmother looked down at her messy fingers, the piles of wasted rice with the wasted onions, and then rinsed her hands under the tap, declaring she was finished cooking. Amidst a great silence, she untied her overall, put all her rings back on her fingers again, and told Faraday that she could make the dolma herself, the way the cookery book advocated. She declared she would never set foot in the kitchen again, having expected a little gratitude from Faraday, not tears. She then went haughtily out to sprinkle eau de cologne on her hands. Afterwards she complained of the smell from the cabbage leaves, and was all for having them thrown down the drain and vine leaves substituted. My mother restrained her, and led her to the salon still grumbling. She then began a long tirade, pointing out the shortcomings of Faraday and the merits of the absent Hajar. That evening, despite my grandmother's poor opinion of Faraday, a dish of beautiful lahan dolmasha appeared on the table. My grandmother told everyone she had made them herself. When she caught my astonished eye, she stared so haughtily at me that it was I who was forced to blush and look away first. Indeed, she half convinced me that she was right. Our guests arrived early and were taken to the salon, where a bright fire crackled merrily in the white china stove, and Inja served little dishes of lokum. Yasmin and Nuri were on their politest behaviour and very demure. In the dining room they sat with Mehmed and me, at a smaller table in the corner, whilst our parents ate at the big walnut table in the centre. During dinner my grandmother talked vivaciously, even being prevailed upon to sip a little raka, which brought the colour to her cheeks. Just as dessert was being served, slices of yellow watermelon in a silver dish surrounded with rice, there came a strange, odd noise which sounded like drums. Everyone at the big table was suddenly stilled. I, noticing the silence, looked at them and saw the colour ebb from my grandmother's face and my mother's hand unsteadily reach out for a fruit knife. My father said, "They are playing the drums tonight. That must mean an announcement of some sort. Let us hope it is good." Our neighbour, Orhan Bey, replied, "They play the drums during Bayram or Ramadan, but tonight is neither. What can it be?" "They play the drums for war also," said my mother faintly, and we all looked at her, surprised that she should intervene in a masculine conversation. "Shevki Hanum, I hope you are wrong. I sincerely hope you are wrong." He spoke jerkily, fussily, unable to entirely hide his own fear. The faint drums beat on, and we finished our dessert almost in silence. The grown-ups toyed with the melon, and my grandmother peeled the tangerine, cutting firmly with her knife into the bright skin, making it stand out around the fruit like a flower. She quartered it with deft fingers, then put it on her plate and sat looking at it with faraway eyes, as though wondering how it got there. The drums came nearer, and I started to tremble. The fear of my elders once again communicated to me. They left the table. The ladies huddled by the window, and my father and Orhan Bey going into the hall and opening the front door. I crept out after my father and stood beside him in the darkness. The drums were nearer now. They sounded their doom, their terrible message, and even to this day I cannot bear the sound of drums. We could hear Bekçi Baba calling something, but he was too far away for us to distinguish what it was he said. My father put his arms around my shoulders, and I pressed against him, feeling intolerably cold and miserable. Then the figure of Bekçi Baba turned the corner of our street, a man beside him beating mournfully on the big drum. They came nearer, the drum beating ceaselessly. "Dan, Dan, da, da, Dan, Dan," cried the drum, and Bekçi Baba came under the lamp before our door to shout his shattering news. "Men born between 1880 and 1885 must report to the recruiting centre within the next 48 hours. Who fails to do so will be prosecuted." And Dan, Dan, da, da, Dan, Dan went the drum, and my heart echoed its melancholy. Orhan Bey shouted, "What does it mean, Bekçi Baba?" And the reply was, "War, war! Don't you know your country is at war?" Bekçi Baba moved off, and the old man with the drum followed him to spread their news farther. We went into the ladies. There they stood by the window, like tree flowers blown in out of the black night, their silk dresses spread about, and their faces pale to the lips. Madame Mougin started to speak, then swayed uncertainly and fainted into my mother's arms. Yasmin and Nuri ran to her, shouting, "Anne, Anne!" and Inja was dispatched for eau de cologne with which to massage the wrists and forehead of Madame Mougin. Whilst my mother was busy with her, Orhan Bey put his arms about his two children and said, "I was born in 1885, and broke off, too full of tears to say any more." He pressed his children closer to him, so close that Yasmin cried out that he was hurting her. Then he released them, looking at them for a moment or two with the eyes of a sleepwalker, the eyes of a man who no longer saw two frightened children before him, but the long, dark, stinking nights in the trenches, and the gun flashes to now and then lighten the sky, and finally the long, dark night of death. Presently his wife recovered. He took her on his arm and with great dignity thanked my mother for her evening and for what she had tried to do for his wife. He bade us good night. My father went with him across the garden, the two children tightly clutching his hands. Mehmed was taken away to be washed, and I stayed in the salon with my mother and grandmother. "Ahmed was born in 1885, said my grandmother. She repeated it softly over and over like a litany. The next day my father left home, for he was going to Saudi to see Uncle Ahmed. All that long day the house was a dead house. I tried to play in the garden with Mehmed, but I was bored and uneasy, sensing accurately my elder's alarm. There was no sign of the children from next door, and the first hint of there being anything out of the ordinary about the day came with the arrival of the cook of Madame Mougin. I was on the back porch at the time and heard her asking Ferdy if the Bacal, the grocer, had been with the bread. Ferdy replied that she too was waiting for him, since she had no fresh bread for luncheon. They talked for a few more minutes in whispers, and although there seemed to be a great sense of urgency about their talk, I could not distinguish anything. I was just left with that queer, empty feeling of there being something wrong, but I could not put a name to what it was. The morning wore away. Inja set the table for luncheon, but still no bread appeared. Ferdy eventually told my mother, who treated the matter lightly, saying that no doubt Bakal had forgotten us this day, and gave permission for Ferdy to go out to buy the bread. We waited over an hour for her to come back, my mother growing more and more impatient, but when she did come, wearily back, she had no bread. "What is wrong?" asked my mother, very surprised. "There is no bread anywhere, Hanum Effendi," replied Ferdy. "Since I left here, I have been standing in a queue, with the people killing each other and breaking each other's heads to get near the baker's door. Some of them were buying 20 loaves at a time. Every family in the district is there, with all their children and their servants, and all of them trying to get a loaf each. The baker had sold out before it was my turn. So we sat down to our meal, grumbling that we had to eat the previous day's bread. We did not know that one day we might be glad to eat bread a week old. During the afternoon, Ferdy again went to hunt bread, but again returned with empty hands. This time she reported that the shop was shut, and that, although the queues were greater than ever, nobody knew when the shop would reopen. Nerves were uneasy that day, and tempers broke easily. My grandmother sat reading the Koran, decorous and pious looking in her black dress and her face pale. My mother sat most of the day in front of the windows, watching for my father's return, her hands strangely empty. What a difference there was in them already. Looking at my grandmother reading the Koran so soberly, it was difficult to find in her the amusing old lady who only yesterday had made us all laugh at her culinary efforts. My mother was very white, a fact emphasized by the dark stuff of her dress, and her busy hands were twining and untwining all the time in her idle lap. Once she asked Inja to fetch her a glass of wine, and the request was so unusual that momentarily Inja forgot all her good training to stare at her in wide-eyed surprise. My father returned in the middle of the afternoon, having been unsuccessful in finding my uncle. My aunt had told him he had left that morning early for the recruiting centre, and she did not know where he was now. She was, my father observed, very distressed. He had called at the Sarriere recruiting centre on his way back to the boat station, but all had been confusion and uproar there. Harassed officials roared instructions and civilians were herded like cattle, hungry, hopeless and apathetic. No one had been able to give news of my uncle. In fact, no one, it appeared, had taken time to listen to my father's questions, and at one time he had been in danger of being herded with the other conscripts. My mother mentioned the incident of the bread, and he laughed tiredly. The streets, he said, were full of panic-stricken people, all looking for something to buy and store. News of Turkey's entry into the war had swept fear into Istanbul, and rioting was taking place in some quarters. He went out himself to seek bread, and returned after many hours with one small hot loaf in his hand. He looked ineffably weary and dispirited, and there was a long scratch down one side of his face, inflicted by a panic-maddened woman who had tried to snatch his bread. Dinner was a sober affair, with us children being urged to hurry, and our elders silently making a pretense of eating. Gone were the leisured, laughter-filled nights of good eating and good conversation, with my grandmother tossing off sparkling, malicious epigrams, and my silent, shy mother only offering her grace and beauty as a contribution to the dinner table. The next morning, Uncle Ahmed came to say goodbye to us. Mehmed and I greeted him quietly, no noise, no fuss this time, for our parents' faces set the pattern for our behaviour. He had brought boxes of bonbons for us, and we were sent into the dining room, whilst they discussed the serious business of war in the salon. Some things in life stand out sharply in the memory, making a picture so vivid, so clear-cut, that the mind's eye retains them indelibly forever. Such a precise memory I have of that November day my uncle visited us for the last time. Sharp and cold was the morning, with sunlight playing behind the scurrying clouds. The house was peaceful and still, as if great things were not happening all around it. The odd job man was sweeping the terrace of the last fallen leaves. Faraday was creating a good, appetizing smell from the kitchen, and Inja was pegging out the washing in the little side yard. The washerwoman sang lustily in the laundry, uncaring of the drafts which swooped moaningly from all about her. What cared she for war? And what cared Faraday or the young Inja for war? Everyone that morning had something to do. I stood with my nose pressed against the window pane and looked out to the windy, rustling garden that held its own wild winter beauty, and Mehmed played busily on the floor. My father came into the room to decant some wine, and, perhaps I looked dejected, or perhaps because Inja was not there to guard us, he told Mehmed and me to go to the salon and play there. In the salon, my uncle was drinking Turkish coffee, looking unhappy. Nobody took any notice of us, so I sat down in one of the chairs, and my mother looked at me, perhaps wondering why I was there. My uncle was talking about my aunt, saying that her health seemed to be getting worse. There was a peevish, worried note in his voice. Then he mentioned the farm, saying that most of the men had registered with him, and who would look after things in the future he did not know. My grandmother sat very silent. She sat looking at Uncle Ahmed, as if her eyes could never see enough of him, her eldest born. She was an unemotional woman, but that day the tears were seldom far from her, only her fierce high pride beating them back. I suppose she was realizing for the first time in her life what war might do to families. For the first time, I think she saw herself as defenseless, an ignorant woman who knew nothing of events outside her own small world, the world which held only sociability, women's gossip, and formality. And the last two men of her family were going from her. I'm quite sure she did not pause to consider my mother's or my aunt's feelings. Naturally cold and a bit of a despot, she only ever saw things in relation to herself. She was losing her sons, might lose them forever. But my mother and my aunt were only losing their husbands. And although my grandmother had a high opinion of husbands, she had a higher opinion of sons. It is trite to say that little escapes of the eye of a child, but nevertheless it is a fact, and I knew my grandmother better then, if more incoherently than she would ever know herself. She had no time for self-analysis, and the Freudian theory had not yet burst over Istanbul. My mother too I knew, and a latent streak of hardness there was in her, so that in after years, when hardness had become her chief characteristic, I was not taken by surprise, having all along recognized its deep down existence. I could not write a true picture of them today, were I not looking back with the eyes of a child to pictures I had thought dead. But just as today these pictures bring back so vividly places, scenes, and conversations that are gone, so too do they recall in part the sensations I felt as a child. That November day, for instance, I knew, as if she were screaming her thoughts aloud, what was going on in my grandmother's head. When she asked my uncle to stay for luncheon, I knew she was prolonging the fatal moment of goodbye. When he refused, she seemed to shrink into herself, looking small and lonely in her tall chair. He said he had many things to attend to in Savardir, and was anxious about my aunt, and all the time he carefully avoided her eyes, perhaps feeling if he looked at her too closely, he too would break down. Presently, he stood up to go. I can still see his tall figure against the windows. I should be leaving tomorrow, he said, when my grandmother inquired for where. He shrugged his massive shoulders and replied that he did not know. He leaned over his mother, kissing her hands, and she murmured a prayer over his bent, dark head, and one hand escaped from his kiss to tenderly stroke his cheek. Uncle Ahmed swung Mehmed on his shoulders, took my hand in his, and went out to the hall. My father said he would accompany him to Galata Bridge, and my uncle beat his foot impatiently whilst Inja helped my father into his overcoat. Then they were ready and we were kissed. My uncle put his hand over my hair and I saw his mouth suddenly quiver. My inadequate heart longed to comfort him. Down the short path they went to the street, and at the corner they turned to wave to us. Then they were hidden from our view and we went back into the house again, Mehmed and I, two small boys who knew of no way to relieve the partings. That evening, Orhan Bey came to bid us farewell. He too was off the next morning to a place he did not know. We drank his health and wished him well, Mehmed and I holding our glasses high with the others, and down the street the drums beat for someone else. For in those days, going away to war, any war, was a brave and noble thing to do. As the young men left the district, so the band would play outside of each of their houses, the Turkish flag being handed to the newest recruit, and all the youth, with their wild, wild hearts, leaped and danced and shouted, the better to drown the noise of the women's weeping. When they were leaving their homes, the band played a song of unbelievable sadness, and everyone started to sing. E gazelir yol gorondu, yeni garip sereme. Daler taşlar dayanamaz, benim u zarima. O wounded ones, I am coming to take your place, and my heart is crying because I am leaving my beloved ones. The mountains and the stones cry with me. Orhan Bey bade us farewell and left us home, and in the street the band still played. Again the next day my father hunted for bread and once again tried to see my uncle. He came home very late, and my grandmother immediately asked if he had seen him. Yes, replied my father. I caught a glimpse of him as they marched him away. And did he look well in his uniform? Demanded my grandmother eagerly. My father said gently, he had no uniform. All the men wore their own clothes and carried bags on their shoulders. They had no marching boots, and armed soldiers kept between them and the crowd, and all their wives and mothers and sweethearts were there. I followed with the crowd, and they were put in a building in Sirkedje. We all waited, hoping for a sight of them, but nothing happened, and in the end the soldiers guarding the building sent us away. My father ceased talking, and his eyes looked bitter. He had seen Uncle Ahmed ordered and pushed and prodded by the butts of guns of the peasant soldiers. He had seen a soldier kick one of the men, but he did not tell these things before my grandmother. The next day my mother prepared a bag for my father, made like the bags the other men had been carrying across their unaccustomed shoulders. Nobody mentioned anything about this going, but we all knew the day would come, so my mother sewed a bag for him, a coarse white linen bag, which she sewed with exquisite stitchery. And I think she sewed her heart into that bag too. For after my father had gone, we who were left saw nothing of her heart. My father's business had been sold, and now he spent the days at home, awaiting his turn with horror and impatience at their delay. It seemed as if the government would never call him, and now that he knew he would have to go, he wanted to be away, to be done with the waiting that tore the heart and whitened the cheeks. But the day came at last. The same drum beat out its poignant message. The same Bekçi Baba stood under the same lamp and delivered his ultimatum. Men born between 1886 and 1892 must report to the recruiting centre during the next 48 hours. Who fails to do so will be prosecuted. And Dan, Dan mocked the drum. My father had been called at last, and we thought that nothing worse than this could ever happen to us. He went that next day to the recruiting centre, and all the remaining young men of the district seemed to go with him. When he returned, I was in bed, but I was not sleeping, even though I could not hear what they talked about. It was a grey day when he left us, a grey, cold day in early December, and because so many others were leaving with him, the band was going to play them all out together, from the lives they had always known to the bleakness of the battlefield. Faraday packed the coarse linen bags with cakes and pies and other delicacies she had prepared for him. My father stood in the middle of the salon, already gone from us in spirit, and he looked about him for the last time. His face was secretive and closed, an alien soldier's face that had no right in his elegant smiling room. My mother stood close behind him, and she too had that alien shut-away look. But my poor huddled grandmother, who could not go to where these two had gone, sat in the windows and listened for the drums that would take away her youngest son. Inja brought in Turkish coffee, Ferdi following with the packed linen bag, and Mehmed ran to pull at her skirts, not understanding what all this fuss was about, or that his father was going away. I went to my father and put my arms around him, and he lifted me up in his arms. "You will be father from now on," he said, and I pressed my head against his face and felt a tear drop on my cheek. Whose tear was it? Mine or his? Perhaps it fell from both of us, for tears tormented both of us. Fergie and Inja burst into loud wailing, their soft hearts inexpressibly touched, but my mother stared dry-eyed. She had, I think, shed all the tears she would ever shed in some private place. And now her frozen heart was able to look on this farewell scene with almost tranquility. My grandmother prayed without stopping, and then she began to mutter, "My eldest son and my youngest son, my eldest son and my youngest son, they have taken you both." The distant drums began, and my father put me down, drinking his coffee quickly. He said, "Shevke, don't look like that. Smile for me. I shall come back again." And my mother's frozen face relaxed to give him her old dazzling smile. My father said to her, "You would make a better soldier than I." They stood there facing each other, smiling their brilliant smiles, not touching each other yet, indissolubly merged into each other. The band came nearer, and now we clearly heard the drums, and the zurna, and the shouting of the following children. My mother's eyes flew away from my father's. The lovely miracle was broken. She picked up his heavy bag and handed it to him, and they kissed like strangers, those two who had no need of kissing. My grandmother held out her hand for his gesture, and Ferdi and Inja then came forward to pay their tribute to him. They were crying bitterly, and he patted their heads as if they were children again, like Mehmed and me. He swung his bag over his shoulder and went to the front door, and the crowd that waited outside. The band played softly and mournfully, and my father kissed us children, then said his goodbye with lips that were wooden and stiff. An old man came forward and handed him the Turkish flag, and the people all shouted, "Padish Ashim Chok Yasha," and my father stepped into his place amongst the other recruits. The waving and the cheering went wildly on, but there was no need to drown the weeping from our house, for the women did not weep. They stood there gently smiling. The band played for my father. "Igezle yol korundu, yene garib şerin. Dalar taşlar dayanamaz, benima u zarima." Then they turned the corner, out of our sight, only the sound of the cheering and the singing voices and the noise of the band coming ever fainter back to us.